The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are.
Most people spend their entire lives waiting for the moment when life finally begins. They wait for success, for love, for money, for recognition, for clarity, for some external event that will make everything feel real. They believe that one day, after enough struggle and enough progress, life will finally open up and reveal itself. But Carl Jung would have said something much more unsettling. Your real life does not begin when you get everything you want. It begins when you stop pretending to be someone else. That is the moment. Not the moment when your problems disappear. Not the moment when everyone finally understands you. Not even the moment when you feel completely happy. It begins when you are forced, or brave enough, to face the truth that the life you have been living may not actually be yours. For most people, this realization comes late. Sometimes very late. Sometimes after years of exhaustion, emotional emptiness, and the slow collapse of an identity they once defended with everything they had. Because what Jung understood better than almost anyone is that many people do not live their lives. They perform them. They perform the role that was rewarded by their family. They perform the version of themselves that makes them acceptable at work. They perform the identity that keeps their relationships stable. They perform intelligence, kindness, strength, confidence, optimism, competence, or morality because those traits were safer than honesty. Over time, the performance becomes so familiar that the person inside it forgets they are acting. They start to believe the mask is the face. They start to confuse adaptation with identity. They start to confuse survival with living. And this is where the real tragedy begins. Because a life built entirely around pleasing others, avoiding conflict, and maintaining appearances may look successful from the outside, but inside it slowly becomes hollow. There are people who look completely put together and still feel lost every morning when they wake up. People who have achieved what they thought they wanted and still feel strangely disconnected from their own existence. People who are surrounded by others and still feel invisible to themselves. Jung would not have been surprised by any of this. He saw it everywhere. He saw people living in a kind of sleep, moving through the world with highly developed social skills but very little contact with their deeper selves. Jung called the social face the persona. It is the mask we wear to survive in society. And there is nothing inherently wrong with having a persona. In fact, we need one. We cannot function in the world without some kind of social identity. We need manners, roles, boundaries, and ways of relating to other people. But the problem begins when the persona stops being a tool and becomes the whole person. When the mask grows so strong that the face underneath it is never seen. When a person spends so much time being what others need that they lose all connection to what they themselves need. Ati said point life becomes something managed from the outside rather than experienced from within. And that is why so many people eventually feel empty even when nothing obvious is wrong. The job may be fine, the relationship may be fine, the family may be fine, the house may be fine, the money may be enough, the social image may even be impressive. But something essential is missing. Something deeper is starving. Something inside keeps whispering that this is not it, that this is not the real thing, that this is not the life they were meant to inhabit. Most people hear that whisper and immediately drown it out with distraction, work harder, scroll more, buy something, achieve something, entertain yourself, stay busy, stay useful, stay visible. Do anything except sit in silence long enough to hear the truth. Because the truth is dangerous. If you listen closely enough, you may begin to realize that many of the choices you made were never truly chosen. They were inherited, conditioned, rewarded, repeated. You may realize that your identity was assembled from the expectations of other people long before you ever had a chance to ask who you were. You may realize that the life you've been trying to protect was built around fear, not truth. Fear of rejection, fear of being judged, fear of being too much or not enough, fear of standing alone, fear of disappointing others, fear of becoming visible in a way that could not be controlled. And this is where Jung becomes so powerful, because he forces us to ask a question most people avoid for their entire lives. Who are you when nobody is clapping? Who are you when nobody is approving? Who are you when no one is watching and you no longer need to play a role? Most people never answer that question honestly because the answer is uncomfortable. It may reveal that the self they have been protecting is not the same as the self they have been living for. It may reveal that their energy has been spent maintaining a life that looks right but does not feel true. Jung believed that the human psyche is not built to remain divided forever. There is always pressure toward wholeness, even when the conscious mind resists it. That pressure can show up as dissatisfaction, anxiety, burnout, emotional numbness, recurring relationship patterns, or a strange and persistent feeling that something essential is missing. These are not always signs that something is wrong in the simplistic sense. Often, they are signs that the psyche is trying to correct itself. The soul is pushing back against the false structure. Something deeper is trying to get your attention. Life is no longer allowing you to remain unconscious without consequence. That is why people often experience turning points through discomfort. A relationship collapses. A job becomes unbearable. A success story feels strangely empty. A betrayal exposes a hidden dependency. A period of loneliness reveals how little they know themselves. A season of burnout strips away every illusion of control. These moments can feel like punishment, but in Jungian terms, they are often invitations. They are not always destroying you. Sometimes they are destroying what was false in you. And that is a very different thing. One of the most important ideas in Jung's work is the shadow. The shadow is everything in us that was pushed out of awareness because it was inconvenient, embarrassing, shameful, unacceptable, or simply too intense for our early environment to hold. It includes anger, need, ambition, vulnerability, selfishness, tenderness, envy, grief, desire, creativity, fear, courage, playfulness, and pain. The shadow is not just the bad stuff. It is also the rejected stuff. The parts of you that never got to develop fully because the world around you rewarded a narrower version of your personality. And when these parts are ignored long enough, they don't disappear. They simply move underground. Then they begin to shape your life from below. You see them in your strongest reactions. You see them in your repeated mistakes. You see them in the people who trigger you the most. You see them in the qualities you cannot tolerate in others. The arrogance that enrages you, the weakness that disgusts you, the neediness that repels you, the confidence that unsettles you, the selfishness that offends you. Sometimes what we hate in others is not simply a moral judgment. Sometimes it is recognition. Sometimes what feels unbearable in someone else is a trait we have denied in ourselves. Not always exactly, not always directly, but often enough that the reaction tells us something important. Jung knew that projection is one of the mind's favorite defenses. We throw our disowned material onto the world and then act shocked when it comes back to us in different forms. This is why self-knowledge matters so much. Because the things that repeat in your life are often the things you have not yet understood. The same kind of partner, the same kind of disappointment, the same kind of emotional pattern, the same kind of conflict, the same kind of emptiness after a temporary high, the same feeling that you are almost becoming yourself, but not quite. These repetitions are not random. They are often the psyche's way of saying, "Look here, you keep missing this. You keep avoiding this. You keep living around this. And until you begin to see what is hidden, you remain trapped inside the same invisible structure." The moment your real life begins is the moment you stop asking only how to feel better and begin asking why you keep feeling this way. It begins when you stop trying to optimize your image and start examining your inner truth. It begins when you become more interested in what is real than in what is impressive. Because a real life is not a polished life. It is not a perfectly branded life. It is not a life that never disappoints anyone. A real life is one that is anchored in something deeper than social approval. It is one in which your actions are increasingly guided by inner necessity rather than external pressure. That process is not glamorous. In fact, it often looks like a crisis. At first, people around you may not understand it. They may say you have changed. They may say you are becoming difficult, distant to intense, to serious, to quiet, to rebellious, to sensitive, to independent. But often, what they are reacting to is not your character. It is your diminishing availability to the roles they preferred you in. When you start waking up, the old dynamics lose power. The person who used to say yes to everything begins to set boundaries. The person who used to laugh off discomfort begins to name it. The person who used to stay small begins to occupy space. And for many people, that is unsettling. But there is no real becoming without some unsettling, no individuation without tension, no depth without conflict. Jung was never interested in a shallow version of growth that only makes you more agreeable. He was interested in wholeness. And wholeness is far more demanding than positivity. It means integrating the parts of yourself that have been exiled. It means admitting your contradictions without collapsing into shame. It means allowing strength and vulnerability to exist together. It means recognizing that you are not only the image you present. but also the fears you hide, the wounds you carry, the desires you repress, the anger you deny, and the possibilities you have not yet claimed. This is why so many people never fully become themselves. They are addicted to certainty. They want a fixed identity before they begin the journey. They want to know exactly who they are before they risk becoming. But Jung's view of the self is not static. It is on time. It reveals itself through conflict, suffering, creativity, solitude, relationships, dreams, and repeated encounters with what you would rather not see. You do not become yourself by inventing a perfect identity and clinging to it. You become yourself by letting the false identities fall away. That can be terrifying, because the false self is familiar. It has history. It knows how to survive. It knows how to get approval. It knows which version of you made people comfortable. It knows how to make you seem stable, intelligent, desirable, responsible, strong, or harmless. The real self is less polished and far more alive, but it does not come with guarantees. It asks for honesty. It asks for uncertainty. It asks for courage. It asks you to tolerate the temporary discomfort of not knowing exactly where you belong while you learn how to belong to yourself. And that is the irony. The path to real belonging begins with separation. Not from everyone, but from the false agreements that kept you disconnected from your own life. You may have to disappoint some people. You may have to grieve some old roles. You may have to abandon some goals that were never really yours. You may have to admit that certain achievements were built more on fear than desire. You may have to face the fact that you have been living according to a script you did not write. That realization can be painful, but it is also liberating. Because once you see the script, you are no longer fully trapped inside it. Jung's idea of individuation is the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, rather than who the world conditioned you to be. It is not about becoming special in a superficial sense. It is about becoming whole, and wholeness does not mean perfection. It means integration. It means the strong part of you no longer has to attack the vulnerable part. It means the ambitious part no longer has to destroy the peaceful part. It means the rational part no longer has to humiliate the intuitive part. It means the wounded part no longer has to secretly run the entire system from the shadows. Wholeness is the ability to hold contradictions without disintegrating. That is maturity set is depth. That is what it means to begin a real life. And a real life begins when you stop betraying your own awareness. It begins when you stop making your peace dependent on other people's approval. It begins when you become willing to feel alone rather than fake. It begins when silence becomes informative instead of terrifying. It begins when you learn to observe your own patterns instead of constantly defending them. It begins when you stop asking how to be accepted and start asking how to be true. That shift changes the entire structure of a human life. Because when truth becomes more important than image, the whole direction of a person changes. You stop chasing only what looks good and start choosing what feels right in your deepest being. You stop confusing busyness with meaning. You stop confusing social success with self-knowledge. You stop confusing being needed with being known. You stop confusing emotional survival with actual living. And although this path can feel lonely at first, it is the only path that leads to a life you can actually inhabit without resentment. Jung understood that many people are afraid of becoming real because reality has consequences. If you discover who you are, you may have to leave people who only loved your compliance. If you discover who you are, you may have to let go of identities that once protected you. If you discover who you are, you may have to admit that some of your pain came from living a life too small for your soul. But this is not tragedy alone. It is also the beginning of power. Not domination, not ego, real power. The kind that comes from alignment. The kind that arises when your outer life is no longer completely disconnected from your inner truth. That is why Jung remains so relevant, because he does not offer a slogan. He offers a confrontation. He asks you to look at the machinery behind your behaviors. He asks you to stop blaming the world long enough to notice the parts of yourself that are still living in the dark. He asks you to sacrifice illusion for reality. And reality, though harder to bear at first, is the only ground on which meaning can stand. A person may live for applause, but applause fades. A person may live for status, but status decays. A person may live for beauty, but beauty changes. A person may live for youth, but youth passes. A person may live for being admired, but admiration is unstable. Only what is real can survive the loss of all those things. Only what is real can remain meaningful when the stage goes dark. That is why finding yourself is not a luxury. It is not a trend. It is not a self-help hobby. It is an existential necessity. Because if you do not find yourself, you will live as an echo of your culture, an echo of your parents, an echo of your fears, an echo of your wounds, an echo of the versions of you that were rewarded before you ever learned to listen inward. And an echo is not a voice. A real life begins when the echo stops. It begins when you can say, with full awareness, that you no longer want a life that only looks alive. It begins when you can tolerate the discomfort of truth long enough for something authentic to emerge. It begins when you stop outsourcing your identity to the crowd. It begins when you discover that you can be alone without disappearing. It begins when your choices are finally shaped by inner necessity rather than fear of rejection. And it begins in the quiet, often painful moment when you choose to stop performing and start becoming. If this message resonated with you, then maybe you already feel where that moment is waiting in your own life. And if you want more deep psychological journeys like this, subscribe to Perpetual Echoes, because here we explore the mind, the shadow, and the truth beneath the mask.